This morning I have a lesson that is talking about determining what is important. I know that we have lessons after lesson after lesson that are preached about priorities and what should be prioritized. But I want to approach this in a little bit different way. You know, I've mentioned several times that modern television just doesn't do much for me. And speaking of modern, I mean 21st century television. I don't know if I've watched much of any of it that I really cared for. So I tend to go back. And really, I think my taste in television is kind of like my taste in music. It tends to go back to the time that I was a teenager, and that's kind of what I like. And one of the programs that was around at that time was a program by the name of Wagon Train. And I watched quite a few Wagon Train episodes today. And one thing I like about them is they have really sometimes detailed plots. It's kind of hard to figure them out. You get to the end, and they're not like a Hallmark movie where every one of them has exactly the same plot and always finishes exactly the same way. They sometimes finish quite differently. But at any rate, I watched them. As a result of that, a few years ago when James and Lindsay and Pat and I went out west, and you know, they got tired of listening to me talking, so they started buying me books that I could read. And one of them they bought me, and I don't know what I did with it. It's a small book. But it was actually the diary of someone who had taken a wagon train from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, which is what that program is actually about. But in this case, it was an actual diary. And I will assure you the diary and the actual events were quite different than that which is pictured on the show. Cleaned up quite a bit. But there was one point in it that the show talks a great deal about, and in the diary, it really made this point that when you would leave St. Joe, going to Sacramento, that there was a certain point in the trip that suddenly you would see pianos, pieces of furniture, boxes of books, and other things just laying by the side of the road. People going from St. Joe to Sacramento would leave with large amounts of things carrying with them that they felt were very, very important. And as they went, and their horses began to tire, and they began to have more and more struggles keeping their wagons together, they began to realize that what looked so important to St. Joe was not nearly so important when you were in the middle of the desert. You didn't know if you were going to be able to go on or not. And so they would start constantly casting things aside. Well, that's when you had to start making up your mind what's really important. What is important here? Because a decision has to be made. Well, you know, if we look at the life of a Christian, kind of like a wagon train, you kind of realize a lot of things apply there. We want to make this kind of a parable type lesson, kind of like Jesus did in Matthew chapter 13, where he gave the various parables of the sower and the tares and the pearl of great price and various other parables, that lost coin that are mentioned there. You know, when you look at that wagon train set out because those people were looking for a better place. In America, before the advent of a lot of modern farming techniques, what usually happened is you went to farm someplace, and after a period of years, you'd kind of, as they called it, deplete the soil, and then you'd let it erode, and you'd have real serious problems, and so you'd just move on to another place. Well, pretty soon the east kind of got filled up, and wasn't any place to move much, and so people began to go west because it was a better place in their estimation. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, when God is talking about this better place, he's talking about Abraham, but he's applying the principle of Abraham leaving his father's country and going to the land of Canaan to all of us. And so he said in verse 14, "For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now, they desire a better country, that is, in heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He hath prepared for them a city. Now that's talking about you and I as Christians. Now, if you think of this world, there are a lot of things you enjoy. There are a lot of things you don't. And as we had read here Wednesday evening in the training class, Ecclesiastes 12, that's been read many, many times, when you look at the aging process, things you enjoy change over the years. And then eventually you get to the point where there's just not much enjoyment in much of anything. That's when we begin to talk about quality of life. Now, when you look at this statement, he really is acknowledging that if you're here upon the earth, that there is the idea as a Christian to go to a better place. A place where you don't have cancer and heart disease, and you don't have all this mistreatment of people, of one another, and you don't have tornadoes to rip your house down, and you don't have snowstorms that you can't get around and even go to the grocery store, that you don't have any of those things, but everything will be absolutely perfect. And that is what he's describing there. So kind of like folks on the wagon train, you and I as Christians are looking for a better place. Now, we talked about as they journeyed, they discovered that there were many things that hindered their progress. You know, when you think about horsepower, on a wagon train, generally there would be either 4 or 6 horses hooked up to the wagon to pull it. And depending on the kind of horses or mules or oxen in some cases that you had, you could pull whatever 6 of them could pull, but it wasn't just pulling. They were going to pull it for 2,000 miles. It wasn't like going to Mule Day and watching them pull it down a football field. 2,000 miles. You know, a wagon train was something that averaged about, in really good circumstances, 10, and maybe just an outstanding day would be 15 miles. Just do the math. I won't try to do that standing here. I'll probably make another mistake this morning, so I won't do that. But it's a long time. It takes a long time to make that trip. So it's something that when there are things that hinder you, you have to start eliminating. And that's when you have to start thinking about what's important here and what's not. As I remember the wagon master on the TV program Wagon Train say, sometimes you decide that beans and bacon are worth more than pianos and dining room tables. So you have to decide what is important to you. Well, in Hebrews chapter 12, he says that we as a Christian make the same decision. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. So what he said was basically the same principle. That there are things that have to be laid aside. You have to make some decisions. What's important? What's right? What's wrong? Those decisions have to be made. I have a friend who lives in Erin who did not become a Christian until he was, I believe, in his 30s, late 20s, early 30s. And when he became a Christian, he was pretty wrapped up in a lot of things in his life. And he said, you know, when I became a Christian, I resigned from all of them. And he said, then I went back as a Christian, and from a biblical perspective, I began to examine them and see what I needed to be involved in and what I didn't need to be involved in. He said, some of the things I went back and began to practice them again. Some of the things I did not. He understood this principle. That as a Christian, we have to make decisions. What's important? What's not important? It's really critical that we understand that. Now, what those people on the wagon train realized pretty quickly was that this is not a piece of cake. It's a pretty hard row to hoe, as we sometimes have used the expression. And in Romans chapter 12, it speaks of the word sacrifice. And they realized that journey was going to require a great deal of sacrifice on their part. One of the things that happened, and a lot of people don't realize this, but I don't remember the exact percentage of people who left St. Joe, Missouri actually reached Sacramento. But if my memory serves me correctly, that close to 20% of the people who left didn't make it. The biggest problem they had, I had always thought would be Indians and that kind of thing, but that really wasn't true. The biggest problem was cholera and related diseases, and it killed a lot of them. Sometimes whole families, just quickly. They would have to just bury them on the side of the road. And next morning, wagons rolled, and the graves were left behind. So you think of the sacrifices that were made. Well, they understood that. He said, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And, he said, be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Now, you know, you as a Christian, just realize the things that have to be changed in your life to make you acceptable to God. And that's the point that's being made in Romans chapter 12. Now, they also saw many of their companions who lacked the resolve to see the journey through, and they would return. Now, there was a kind of a point of no return. I remember when we actually were coming through Nebraska, on that same trip I spoke of earlier, that we went to a town and it was kind of the jumping off point. The people who left St. Joe would go to this town in Nebraska, and when they got there, that was kind of the point that you had to make up your mind. It was kind of the point of no return. If you go past that point, you're not going back to St. Joe. So they had a lot of people who would say their goodbyes and say, hey, you know, this is tougher than we thought. We're going back to St. Joe and then on back to the east to the farms that we thought were so unproductive, but they were pretty easy to deal with compared to this. In John 6, you find that being a Christian's like that. If you look about you in this audience and you think of the seats that you have, there are a lot of seats that are empty because people died. There are also some seats that are empty because people are no longer faithful to God, are no longer striving to serve God, and have chosen rather to live their life as they please. Now that's true. And you know it to be true, and I know it to be true. Why? Because they made some decisions, and what they decided was that serving God wasn't very important, and there were other things more important than that. Well, that's what happened in the days of Jesus. When these people heard what Jesus said, they didn't like it. It's hard saying. From that time, many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him. You know, when you stand before God in judgment, you wonder how many people will be there who once were children of God and who no longer are. Just think about that. Yeah, it's kind of like a wagon train. More people leave than ever reach the destination. Some of them fall to death, but a lot of them just decided, I can't handle it. I can't do it. But like them, we have to decide if it's worth it. Is it worth it? A lot of them decided it was. They went on. 2 John verse 8 makes a statement that's really an interesting statement. And here's what he said. Talking to you and I as Christians. He says this. Look to yourselves that we lose not those things which we have wrought, but that we receive a full reward. You know, sometimes you look at a football team, a college football team, and you may or may not realize that there are many athletes who come from cities and have opportunities, and it's tougher than they thought, and they just don't stay. sometimes they go quite a while. I knew a guy one time that went to work for the post office who had just gotten out of the Army. I said, how long are you in? He said, 12 years. I said, 12 years? You couldn't stay for another 8? No. So he gave up the 12 years and lost a great deal because he quit. Well, that's what he's saying here as a Christian. Just think of people who obey the gospel and they strive to serve God, but then eventually, because they just began to make bad decisions about what's important and what's not, they lose those things that they had invested their life in. Peter talked about that in 2 Peter chapter 2 that you've probably heard many times. And there's a statement in that some of us have a hard time understanding. I'm not sure that I understand it perfectly. Peter begins this discussion by saying this. If after they have escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they're again entangled therein and overcome, the latter end is worse with them than the beginning. And people have thought about that. And I've heard explanation after explanation. I'm not sure that any of them are perfect. But I wonder sometimes if the real point he's making is that how bad it is that you invest so much time and energy in being a Christian and get it up. I don't know if that's his meaning or not. But I do know this. He said it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than after they have known it to turn from the holy commandment delivered unto them. You know, I tell you something that I wonder sometimes, and I don't know the answer to it because this is something I've never seen anything concerning. When someone left some worn-out farm in Ohio with their neighbors, they're going to California to the rich farmlands there, and some of them turned around in Nebraska and went back to St. Joe and returned to those poor farms, and they were just scratching out a living. When they got a letter from these folks who talked about how enormously successful they've been, I wonder how they felt. I don't know. But I wonder if that's not some of what Peter's talking about here when he's saying, just think about it. You're investing a lot of time and energy in being a Christian. See it through. Because if you don't, it's happened to them according to the true proverb, the dog is turned to his own vomit again, and the sow that was washed to her wallowing in the mire. That first illustration is one that a lot of people have trouble with. It's hard to even want to visualize what a bad mistake that is. So this life's kind of like a wagon train, isn't it? Well, let's stop and ask yourself this question. You know, things that must be given up will vary. I've said a lot of times, you think about it. When Paul became a Christian, when Luke, who was a Gentile, became a Christian, their background is very different. When the people in Athens became a Christian, background may have been different than either one of those two. So a lot of changes that are taking place will be different from person to person. It's kind of like temptation. I mean, things that are a temptation to some are not to others. I mean, I can remember when George Bush was the president and the criticism he received because he would not drink alcoholic beverages at various state functions. And he said something that I've never forgotten. He said, I was an alcoholic. I am an alcoholic. If I start drinking, I'm going to keep drinking. And I won't drink. That's what he said. But you know what? Well, a little bit in my lifetime I've ever tried to drink, I hated the stuff with an absolute passion. So I don't have any interest in it. Period. So there are things that are different from person to person. I realize that. But everyone, as they become a Christian, find themselves having to make decisions about things that they're going to keep them in their lives or are they not. Well, I'm not going to try to look at everything. But I do want to try to look at this. Sometimes we read a passage, we don't think much about it. We may not even try to remember. It's like we sing a song, Here I Raise My Ebenezer, and sometimes people don't really take the time to even try to realize what an Ebenezer is. So it doesn't mean much to them. Sometimes you read a passage that's kind of like that. You don't really know what it's talking about much. Matthew 6, verse 24. No man can serve two masters. For either will hate the one, love the other, or else he will hold to the one and will despise the other. He said you cannot serve God and mammon. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that he's saying God and the devil. That's not what he said. The word mammon is really defined as material things. It is the material world. So you can't serve God and the material world at the same time. That doesn't mean you can't enjoy things in the material world. That's not what he's saying. Doesn't say that you can't work and earn a living in the material world. That's not what he's saying either. But notice the word serve. Put your emphasis on it. Decide this is what's going to be important to me to the exclusion of other things. Now that's what he's really talking about. He said you can't serve God and mammon. You got to make up your mind. You know, when you look at Jesus, there's probably the absolute epitome of that argument, because he said that he laid down his life. That's the ultimate possession that we have. Willingly, for a spiritual purpose, salvation of our soul. That really kind of illustrates the point. God is one. Now think about this. Serving the flesh can express itself in many ways. But serving God in only one, that's obedience. If you think about it, and we won't take the time to read everything because we're getting a little short of time. But in Galatians 5, where he talks about the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these, there's all kinds of things. Very different things. Everything from sexual immorality to witchcraft to bad attitudes to jealousy and the misuse of mind-altering products. All of them. They're all different. And people who commit one don't necessarily commit the other. But the fruit of the Spirit is what? Notice the word fruit as opposed to the word works. The fruit of the Spirit has to do with obedience to God. And if you are devoted to the Spirit, he said, they that are Christ have crucified the flesh with the affections and lust. If we live with the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. Very important that we realize the truthfulness of that statement. Now, as you face the everyday decisions of life, you're looking at your life and you're making decisions. You decide what's important or not. That's what you're doing. Do you make the right decision about what's valuable and what's not? Now, that's a question. That's something that you need to consider and you need to think about. Matthew 13, that parable of talents, that chapter of parables, I said it wrong, that chapter of parables. In the midst of it has this parable. The kingdom of heaven is like unto a merchant man seeking goodly pearls, who, when he had found one pearl of great price, went and sold all he had and bought it. When we become a Christian, we have to be all in. It's the thing that becomes predominant. And decisions that we make have to be made in accord with that. And let me tell you something. You need to keep in mind, do you keep in mind that it is what you do that matters, not your intentions? How many people do you think in this world have real wicked intentions? Well, probably not a lot of them. There are a few just wicked, mean people, but most of us, we have pretty good intentions. May sometimes even state things, state our intentions. But Jesus asked a question in the midst of this deal dealing with this very problem. A certain man had 2 sons. He came to the first and said, Son, go work today in my vineyard. And he answered and said, I will not. But afterwards he repented and went. He came to the second and said likewise, and he answered and said, I go, sir, and went not. Whether of them twain did the will of the Father? And they say in him the first. And Jesus said, now think about it. That's what he's saying. It's what we do. We can say anything. I mean, there's people that say all kinds of things, but they have no intention of doing any of them. As a Christian, we cannot act in such a manner. Some things to think about. We're going to just very quickly go through them. You know, if you're not a Christian, what keeps you from entering the kingdom of God? You need to think about it. How important is it as opposed to your soul? Well, you remember the rich young ruler? You know exactly what his problem was. He had great possessions, and he went away sorrowful because of that. You think of this when you think of a contribution. And you're looking at what you're going to contribute and what you're not going to contribute, and you decide, what kind of criteria do you use? Well, Paul said, every man according as he purposes his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly of necessity, but God loveth a cheerful giver. Think about that. We really have to give as we're prospered. That's what he says in 1 Corinthians 16. You think about this. When we don't attend, what is it that keeps us away? Is it legitimate? We sometimes talk about providentially hindered. And there are things we can't avoid. I understand that. But sometimes we have to make a choice. We decide what we're going to do. What's the criteria that we use? Well, in this passage, it's interesting what he says. He says, let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for he is faithful that promised. Let us consider one another to provoke and to love and the good works, not forsaking the assembling together of ourselves as a manner of some is. Now think about it. I mean, when we begin to make decisions, we have to decide. We have to look. Now, we'd rather not think about that. I'm sure. This is a really unpleasant thought, to think of doing something deliberately. But here's the problem. Everything in life that we do, in almost every case, is a deliberate act. It's not just accidental. Some are, but most of them are not. Most of them we make a decision. And that's what, in fact, we do in those cases. When you think about studying, do we study to improve ourselves if we're a Christian? If not, what keeps us from it? Television? Golf? Fishing? Running around with your friends? I don't know. Whatever it is. Could be anything. Doesn't make any difference. But we make decisions about that. And if you look at that passage there in Hebrews chapter 5, he's talking about people who, when the time comes, they ought to be teachers. What's the problem? You have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and to become such as have need of milk and not of strong meat. Well, he tells you what the problem is. Everyone that useth milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness. He is a babe. But strong meat belongeth to them that are full age, even to those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Now, last thing, and this is a pretty generalized thing, all of it was. When you look at Genesis chapter 3, is there ever an excuse for an immoral act? You probably have heard a lot of them. You probably have heard people offer excuses for immoral acts. Well, they're no different than the first man. When Adam was confronted by God because of the sin that he committed, you know what he did? He blamed his wife. He said, the woman whom thou gavest to me, she gave me of the tree of life, and I did eat. And that's the truth. Now just think about it. Just think. When you're making important decisions, and you're making important decisions every single day of your life. Now, it's been about as first principles you can get, so I don't need to repeat anything to offer an invitation, but just say to you, just stop and think. You're making decisions. Decide what it's going to be, and look at what you're going to use as a means of deciding. A lot of people think that decisions are important. That's really not so. That's not true. What's important is the criteria you use to make the decision, because that's going to dictate what the decision is. Just think about that as together we stand as we sing.